Okay, so just quickly to go over a summary of what we just did the last class, just to refresh everyone's memory. We did an introduction to kind of the basic concepts in psychology and orthodoxy. We talked about how psychology does come from outside the church, but what does that mean? Because, right, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. So, like, there's this interesting connection between what's outside the church and what actually does belong to the church in a sense still. So we kind of concluded that, like the Egyptian gold that the Hebrews took out of Egypt, we can use these things that are outside of the church for good or for evil. We can make a golden calf out of it, or we can make an ark that glorifies God out of it. So that is then our responsibility. So then I suggested that the attitude we should have toward things like therapy and psychology should be maybe characterized by the phrase discerning openness. We don't need to be against it and write it off. We also shouldn't just inhale it without any second guess. So today, just to go more deeply into sort of the underlying philosophy and anthropology of these two things. This is probably the more heady of the three sessions. I'll try not to get bogged down in little details and things, but just discussing some of these things will require going just a little bit deeper. But again, same with last time. As you have questions, especially if it's a relevant question, feel free to raise your hand and talk about it, because it might actually help the rest of the class too. So, so the world of therapy and psychology and orthodoxy, there is a totally different worldview between these two. With that comes a different set of assumptions, and all these assumptions and all these aspects of the worldview can have a big impact on how we would interact with those things, how we pursue healing in these things, and how our issues are addressed by these two approaches. So I think it's necessary to understand both of these and kind of go one by one to sort of understand more about how they fit together. Starting with kind of philosophical assumptions, and again, broad strokes are necessary. There's going to be variance in practice, but sort of more philosophically speaking, but speaking broadly for the field, unless you have a Christian therapist who's specifically somebody who's like unusually committed to the Christian worldview, what you'll have with psychology is what you would expect from a field of science. Science doesn't really address what ought to be; it addresses what is, or how to do something. Right? You can't really do experiments to answer questions of what should be or what right is, but you can use experiments to answer what will happen. If X happens, Y will be the result, right? So the important thing then is not that psychology has all the right answers about the worldview necessarily, but that it does what it says. It's a field that says, if you have this problem, then it has been shown that this approach can help with that problem, can get you to this goal. It doesn't have anything to say about what the goal should be necessarily, but rather just that it will get you there. So it doesn't really seek, in a way, hopefully, to provide answers to what ought to be. But that said, it's complicated, and there's always going to be some bleed over in between the two of those. But in another way, the world of psychology is inherently like scientistic, not just scientific, but assuming naturalism. This is sort of the default worldview, right? Like science kind of says, I'm going to assume atheism until it's proven otherwise, right? So there's just this assumed kind of atheism. That's the way it works. There's not really much room for like God or the supernatural or other things like that in mainstream psychology. So with that comes other assumptions. Like there's no assumption of eternity in the world of psychology and therapy. Again, unless your therapist personally has that conviction and they're sharing that with you. There's no real way to say what truth is or what good is. It's all subjective, and these things in psychology tend to be irrelevant unless they're like imminent, right? So you don't always need to address what truth is from a psychological point of view, except for insofar as it will point you towards something that will help you with your mental health. So they don't need to wrestle with these like deep philosophical things. They just need to say, you're trying to get here, let's get you there. Hopefully I can clarify that as I go on a little bit. So same thing with morality. The goal, there's no wide-ranging morality that can cover the psychological or atheistic worldview or anything. It's just all about to flourish, whatever that means for you to get what you want out of life, for you to have your goals met. Perhaps they would subscribe to some element of like the golden rule, that's basically a system of morality they can follow, like it's right to do things to others that you would want done to you. But at the end of the day, there's no philosophical basis for that in atheism or in naturalism. So it's just kind of arbitrary. There's nothing holding that up or propping that up. So at the end of the day, the only basis for everything is utility. Like what will make you happier? What will make you lose your depression or your suicidal ideations or whatever your issue is? It's all just grounded in what will get the results, which of course leaves a lot on the table about what's right, what you should do. So you kind of end up with what I would call like an enlightened hedonism. You're essentially seeking pleasure, which is deeper than just like the surface level, pleasure in a moment, but happiness. You're seeking alleviation from your pain. You're seeking kind of what you want out of life. Again, not a bad thing, but it can be shallow. So I guess by extension, you could see that if a psychologist was working with a person and the person's goals were to flourish in life and to explore what they've always wanted to do, and they feel that their spouse, for instance, is getting in the way of this, or kind of bringing them down. There's no real principle in psychology to say maybe you shouldn't divorce your wife unless the psychologist and the person come to the conclusion that the wife is actually helping you to reach those goals all along. There's nothing to say, well, we should care about this other person because regardless of your happiness, we have to think about other people as well. Or there's not any basis for that. And in addition to that, there's no real way to understand something like humility or self-sacrifice in a psychological worldview. Again, except for insofar as it leads to utility. So like if you are arrogant to the point where nobody likes you, then perhaps you could seek humility just to the extent that people can stand being around you, but not in any sort of deep, enduring sense, like the way Christianity asks us to be humble. Okay, so how about like philosophical, ontological assumptions in the Orthodox? A few basic things. So God is real. That's at the cornerstone of everything. God is the creator. God is self-existent. He's eternal. We are not. We are created. Another idea, we and the world are fallen. So this is an idea that psychology can't really have any purview in. Like, we commit ourselves to this idea that things are not as they should be. So the fallen world has, I guess the easiest ways to describe it would be death is the number one, but also corruption, disease, inclination to sin, all forms of evil. We all have this sense that something isn't quite right in the world, and the church says, yes, it's a fallen world. So let's see. I won't get into the weeds on that so much. So another kind of assumption. The spiritual world is real. It's not just us and our brains. There are angels, there are demons, there's spirituality happening all around us. This has the extended principle that not everything that happens is us, exactly, and certainly not in the true sense. We believe that thoughts can be introduced into our mind by demons. In addition, because we accept that mankind is fallen and the world is fallen, anytime we have a thought, we wouldn't have the assumption that this comes from me somewhere deep down inside. Whereas in psychology, it's a scientific worldview. There's no supernatural, so any thoughts you have can only come from you. There's no spiritual, there's no anything outside of you, and that changes the way that you would approach things. So anytime you have a extremely disturbing thought, if you're assuming, naturalism, atheism, you have to conclude this comes from somewhere in me. This is truly in me, and I need to deal with it. Whereas in orthodoxy, it's not that way. Sometimes when we have horrible, blasphemous, evil thoughts, we don't need to say, this is me. I'm identifying with that thought. We can say, this is demons tempting me. This is my fallen nature. This doesn't represent who I truly am, which would change how we address that. In addition, with the Christian worldview, eternity is a factor. So all of a sudden, because that's the case, temporal sufferings can be justified, right? You might want to stick with that wife who you would want to divorce because it's a means of God to work out your salvation for you. God is using that difficult situation to train you to become something great for eternity. In addition, we have a moral grounding in God, where God created the world from himself, and there's morality and there's ideas of right or wrong that are truly grounded in him, that we can always put back on him and set it in stone in him. And the same thing with truth. There is a truth. It's not just subjective. It's not just what works good for me. It's something that is true in the fullest sense. Just one more note on morality. So in Orthodoxy then, to live a moral and virtuous life, to live a good life with God, that is the definition of rational. That is rational living, because God is truth. God is the source of all of our being. So to live in accordance with God and in accordance with God's ways is the only actual rational way to live. We can't get to God or reach up and grab him and pull him down, right? We see this in the Tower of Babel, where humanity was essentially trying to go up and seize God, right? Building a tower to the sky to apprehend him, but that doesn't work. God always has to come down to us. He reveals himself to us. Just a quick aside, I guess, on faith and reason, because it's coming into, you can see some of the differences between these two worldviews are that we would have this respect for faith, whereas the generic psychological worldview would really only have concern for reason. The Orthodox would say that reason is a natural faculty. We were created with it. It's part of our image. However, we would say it's limited. It's not the end-all be-all, but it is certainly real. It's not something to just throw away either. The idea that you see in the Fathers is that they're actually designed to work in unison. So a few quotes from the Fathers. St. Ilias the Presbyter says, "The best defense against bad thoughts is, quote, the alliance of the nous with the reason, and of the reason with sense perception." So using the reason along with our spiritual faculties to address bad thoughts or whatever other spiritual issue we might be having. Likewise, St. Maximus says, the rational faculty is critical for knowledge, and knowledge is critical for faith and hope. St. Isaac the Syrian sees reason fulfilled in faith. He says, knowledge is perfected by a heart that believes. Let's see. So I guess the concept there then is that faith is sort of like this Rosetta Stone. It's this way that interprets our reason so that it doesn't just run wild and go in any direction what it wants. But through faith, we can ground our reason and use it so that it can be of the fullest benefit, so that it can do what it was truly meant to do. And the true end and purpose of reason from an Orthodox worldview is true knowledge, not just thinking we know something in our brain, but to actually get a personal encounter, personal knowledge of the divine. Okay, so anthropology of psych, I talked about this a little bit. Again, with psychology, there's no way for them to actually have some kind of doctrine of what man is, but there's this general assumption that man is just essentially an animal. They might have ideas and rights about the dignity of human beings, and certainly in professional statements and goal statements, they would back up these ideas about the rights of human beings and dignity for all humans, but essentially that's, at the end of the day, arbitrary, because they can't ground it in anything. They're just kind of making it up and saying we think humans should all have basic rights. And again, like I said, because they're assuming no spiritual world, everything that you think is you. It's in your brain. The brain is governing everything. There's no real soul, which leads to certain consequences. Anthropology orthodox-wise, Mankind cannot really be described or thought of outside of a relationship to God. That's how we have to ground who we are and what we do. Everything that you have to say about man has to do with God, because we came from God and we're destined to go back to Him. We're made in the image of God. This word nous that you hear thrown around a lot in Orthodox circles, we're going to go into that a little bit. I think it's necessary to dive into a little bit of that, what that means. So the idea of our nous, sometimes you see it equivocated with our spirit. It's a part of our soul. Sometimes the fathers will call it the purest part of our soul, the eye of the soul. The nous is essentially our receptive faculty inside of us that can receive information. So when we have an experience of God, that is our nous, kind of receiving that. And it's not related to your brain exactly. It's not that your brain is excluded from it. It's just that sort of direct experience. The Orthodox would talk about that in terms of having its origins in our faculty of the nous, which is a Greek word that doesn't translate that well. That's why we always say nous. So the soul and the body, real quick. The body being the material aspect of mankind, and the soul would be the non-material aspect. So like our thoughts, our nous, our rationality, everything that isn't material in us would be what we mean by soul. And soul and body exist in relationship to one another. So there's no sense in which one possesses the other, or like we are a soul and we just have a body, or we are a body and we just have a soul. God's intentions for us are always worked out with these two things in conjunction. Right? That's why death is unnatural, the separation of the soul and the body. To be fully human, we have to have a body and a soul. That's what we are, is body and soul. This is part of the reason why we don't go to heaven forever, quote unquote, right? Our idea of eternity is not going to heaven, but rather being resurrected, joined with our body. So one consequence of that with what we're talking about here today is that thoughts are related to the brain, but then they're also related to our spiritual faculties. So there's this kind of connection and this bridge between the spiritual and the physical with us. Sometimes people contrast the nous, which I was just talking about, with the more rational aspect of us. So I said the nous is, think of it as like an eye, or the sensing part of us. It receives, it takes in information. It's a fancy way to say it would be the conduit of divine knowledge, right? Whereas our reasoning, our rational faculty would be more like searching out something. How do we pursue knowledge? And we can use logic, etc., to pursue that. Let me see how I'm doing on time. Okay, so a little bit more on the nous. The nous is connected to the entire soul, so all of us, and also to our entire body. So it's implicated in everything. So in a sense, the nous is what we are trying to purify. When we talk about, the Orthodox split up the image and likeness of God. We were created with both. The image is sort of how we are, what's in us, and that was not lost in the fall. But what was lost in the fall was the likeness to God, and that's what we're trying to bring back through our spiritual life. The nous is sort of that cloudy mirror that we're trying to purify. It's that deepest part of ourselves that is really who we are at the deepest level. So, St. Maximus says that we're made to be divinized, we're made to become like God, and because of this we are made with natural sort of seeds of godliness or virtues inside of us. So interestingly, man doesn't just acquire virtues, virtues are some sort of abstract thing that we need to pursue, but we're actually created with virtues inside of us. St. Dorotheos of Gaza says, "For truly when God made man, he sowed the virtues in him." So in that sense then, illnesses, spiritual illnesses, mental illnesses, would be perversions and misuses of our natural faculties. These things that we have that were supposed to be good, but that because of the fall, they're clouded, they're perverted, they're not used properly. And the idea is that when we remove the passions of the soul, these things that kind of drag us down and keep us in that fallen state through asceticism, that there is virtue there. Once you can get all the junk out of the way, there's gold there, right? That's the idea. And while God gives us grace to sustain this movement toward Him, this effort of our life toward Him, He doesn't force us. He never makes us puppets and makes us love Him. Quickly, again, this is, I said, like, this is the session where it's getting in the weeds, and I'm just like trying to make sure I'm not getting bogged down in anything. But quickly, talking about what the will is, you can split that into, and the Father split it into what they call the natural will and the gnomic will. And the natural will, think of it as that inclination in all of us to always do the right thing. It's always moving toward God. When it's not fallen, the natural will in us will always push us to do the right thing. So this can kind of be equivocated with our conscience in a way. It's this thing that's pushing us to always, just without question, follow God. The gnomic will is a consequence of the fall, and the Fathers say that this is sort of like the deliberative part of us. When we know that we shouldn't do something, or that something is bad for us or wrong, and we have to sit there and be like, I really want to do that thing, but maybe I shouldn't, and like that would be the gnomic will. And a little tidbit, the Orthodox Church teaches that Christ did not have a gnomic will. He just had a natural will. The gnomic will is this consequence of the fall. So when Christ was in the wilderness and the devil was tempting him with bread, he wasn't like laboring within himself like, I really want the bread, but rather he had the natural will and he saw like the right thing to do. And he felt the pain of his hunger, but he still proceeded kind of directly to God's will. He had this connection with God's will. So this life of sin or passions, the idea would be that these free choices of ours would actually repress our natural will and kind of get us stuck into our gnomic will, into this sort of deliberative place where we don't really know what's right or wrong. It clouds our conscience. It makes it hard to choose the right thing. It makes it hard to know what the right thing is. And the idea being that when we purify the nous, we just have a straight path ahead of us. So St. Gregory Palamas says, assimilation to Christ, that is to say, the health and perfection of the soul. St. Simeon, the new theologian, refers to the nous that's obscured by sin as the extinguished lamp of the soul. And St. Dorotheos of Gaza refers to the conscience as he says, a twisted, forsaken conscience resembles a damaged mirror. We may even think we don't have one when we've damaged it enough. Let me just move on past that. So, why does all this matter? Why do we have to go into all this sort of deep stuff? And again, this is broad strokes. Feel free to talk to me if you want to dive into this stuff a little bit more. But just to give an idea of who we're saying we are, what is the problem and what's the cure, we need to know these things. We need to know what is wrong and how to go about fixing it. That'll change the way we think about what healing is. So at the end of the day, we heal one way from psychology. It heals us in one sense, but the Orthodox way of healing us heals us in an entirely different way. I think the key there is that we have to remember we're not just temporary creatures. We're destined for much more than happiness or just temporary functionality or just having, quote, a good life. The Orthodox spiritual life is always pushing us toward that eternal, that transcendent, that which is beyond. And psychology, while it can be useful, is ultimately just aiming at the temporal. So quickly, some of this will be summary. So the goals of psychology and orthodoxy then. Mental health, you could sum it up saying that they're concerned about our happiness, our functionality, our fulfillment, our freedom from disease, and this is pursued through evidence-based therapy with trained clinicians or by use of drugs. The Orthodox spiritual life is pursuing theosis, salvation, becoming like God. And so it's not just a change of mind, it's an ontological change. We change kind of who we are at our deepest being. We have this eternal communion with God. And God is love, God is life, God is joy. And so to make this change includes physical and mental health ultimately, though maybe not temporarily. This is pursued in Orthodoxy explicitly through sacraments, prayer, fasting, the ascetic life, just living the church life in general. But in a broader sense, it's pursued implicitly by everything we do. Like I was saying the last time, everything we do is included in our spiritual life. Everything is relevant to our spiritual life. St. Sophrony says, there is a difference between psychology and life in Christ. Psychology attempts to deliver man from guilt complexes, whereas in life in Christ we experience grief and pain on account of being far from God, and we do not stop repenting until this grief is transformed. So not to denigrate the psychological life, but some could see psychological healing from an Orthodox perspective as limited by being somewhat like a Band-Aid. It kind of covers something up. But it doesn't ever aim at our full healing, at our true healing. Let's see. So a little bit more in depth on how Orthodoxy pursues this healing. So again, just a little bit of review. I said we have this fallen condition, we have misused faculties, and so we have inordinate amounts of self-love and self-interest. We're willing to throw people under the bus for our own desires, in a sense. We have habits that kind of bring us down. The idea of asceticism, that's like spiritual exercises, would be that we have this sort of spiritual unconscious, and the sort of dark side of it is always trying to drag us away from God, always trying to drag us down. That includes not just demons and dark powers, but our own kind of self-will. We have this side of us. And asceticism partially works by bringing that unconscious world to the conscious, so we can see truly what that actually is. Like you might have had an experience where you're tempted to a certain sin and you can't see past that. It just looks so attractive to you that you're stuck on it, and then you end up committing it because you're just, you've got blinders on. The idea of living the ascetic life is to be able to see more fully that thing that we all know, logically speaking, that this won't lead to anything good. This will pull me down. This will cause destruction to my life. In addition, Orthodoxy provides this interaction with our Creator, right? I said the movement of life is a movement from kind of our fallen condition up to God. So God provides that for us by revealing himself to us and also giving us a chance to interact with him. So this would include the Eucharist, which is the body and blood of Christ. It would also include prayer, which is best thought of as just converse and union with God. I think that's the classic definition from the ladder of divine ascent. And just God's grace, always pulling us toward him. The idea is that we would remove our pride as a way for God to always be able to draw near to us. And when it's always pride. Whenever God can't give more and more of himself to us, it's because we would just be too prideful. That's what the fathers tend to say about God is always trying to give as much of himself as he can to us. He's always trying to fill us with himself. And it's just when we feel prideful and when we start saying, I'm the one who did this great thing, or I'm so good at doing my prayer rule, that God says, I have to pull back, because if I keep giving you grace, you're going to become a monster. So again, the idea is to reestablish that original virtue that we had and bring us up to God. So through all these connections with God, we taste the sweetness of the Creator, we see his love, we see the purpose, we see the fullness of eternity, and we're drawn to it, and we pursue this, and we fight for it over a life. Not just in our explicit religious behaviors, but also just day-to-day interactions, being kind to people, being loving. This idea of good deeds that we do, loving deeds that we do, restoring our likeness to God, right? Because as we love, we are becoming like God, because God is love. A quick aside on confession, and we're going to do a little comparison between like psychology and therapy and confession. What do some of the fathers say about confession, how it heals us? John Cassian says that just seeing how an illness works can cure it, right? And this is an idea that's reflected in psychology as well, that if you understand your illness, if you understand your problem, only at that point can you actually do something about it and fix it. That's part of the idea with confession. We name the thing that's wrong, we get it out in the open so we can see what it is and set about fixing it. Nothing can get fixed if it's just sitting there in the dark. So through that process of confession, through the process of always examining ourselves and saying, this thing that I did, this belongs to the fallen nature, this is not me, this is not toward God. Over a process of that, the idea is that sin would become foreign to us. We would recognize it as this fallen thing instead of identifying it with ourselves. Instead of saying, I did this and that was fun and I'm going to do it again. So comparing confession with psychology, first interesting thing to note, psychology, modern psychology at least, really started in Protestant countries where there was no confession. Just to point that out, like some would say that there was more of a need, more of a desire for psychological services because they didn't have that experience of revealing what's truly inside of you to somebody else. So similarities, the idea of speaking of an illness in front of people bringing improvement. This is a cornerstone of psychology. Recognizing the danger of isolating, and if I just hide this, then it'll never get better, it'll eat me up from the inside. The idea that it's completely confidential, so just like Father Theophan can't tell anybody about what you say in confession, the same thing with psychology. There's this understanding of absolute secrecy, and part of that being so that people feel free to say what's truly on their mind. In addition, a spirit of no judgment. So you'd be hard-pressed to find a confessor who, while you're confessing to him, would have anything but love and compassion for you. That's what makes somebody qualified to be a confessor, is if they're able to love people so deeply that they wouldn't fall into judging people. They're just always a fellow traveler seeking healing who has compassion and love for you and is praying for you. That's echoed in psychology. The idea is not to judge you or make you feel worse or pick you apart or anything like that. And then just in general, like I sort of said already, this recognition of the importance of hidden, deep thoughts. But there are some differences. In psychology, there's no sense of absolution. Your sins or your faults don't really have anywhere to go. They're just your faults that are in your past, and you can try to not dwell on them and not let them ruin your life. But in Orthodoxy, there's this guarantee. You will always hear at the end of a good, honest confession, God forgives you. You hear this certainty. In psychology, there's not necessarily any right or wrong. There's just simply guilt in reducing it, right? So like if you have an inordinate idea of like how guilty you are, the point of the psychology would be to reduce your feelings of excessive guilt so you can get on with your life. But in Orthodoxy, that's not the case. There is a right and wrong. God has certain qualities, and we're called to bring ourselves toward those qualities, to come to know Him and to live like Him. As I said before, psychology can accept the unconscious. And from an Orthodox point of view, if what you're doing in therapy is revealing your deepest thoughts, and the therapist is sort of accepting them and asking you to accept them, what you'd be doing is accepting your fallen self, accepting your fallen ego, your old man, as who you actually are. So you're in this place where you're actually accepting this kind of evil parasite that's attached to your back and saying, that is me and it's okay. Whereas the Orthodox would point us towards like, no, that's not you. Like, that's you. You know, you're supposed to be like Jesus. You're supposed to be moving toward Him, and that's who you truly are. So don't call yourself that fallen person. You don't need to identify yourself with that, and you also don't need to identify yourself with all the demonic thoughts that could be placed in your head. Yes?
They said is there not a place for those who go to a therapist in their dealing with difficult interpersonal relationships? So there's a family member or a friend that they're struggling with, how they're dealing with that, or just those types of things that, say they've gone through something that may or may not be dealing with their sins or their sinful nature, but just either, traumatic events in their life or something of that sort, that there is appropriateness for a therapist.
Sure. I hope it's not coming across, I'm talking about like these kind of heavier things, but I would definitely not say that there's like no place for therapy because the only work we need to be doing is like sort of this heavy existential work of cleansing ourselves from sins. I would say that's the best place for therapy is in terms of like solving these problems. It's like the precise art that we've learned and owned, and as a way to get over these things. So there's certainly a place for it. I'm not trying to like denigrate it entirely. I'm just talking more in terms of I guess like existential questions, like what provides like the true ultimate healing, and I'll kind of bridge that gap today. Okay, a couple other things just on this. Well, there's a couple other small differences. So, for example, you might get advice from your confessor. He might hear what you're saying and have input for what you should do. We talked about before how psychologists tend to stray away from giving advice, especially in a Freudian kind of school of thought, in the psychodynamic approach. It's not so much about giving advice, it's about pulling up from what was in your unconscious and making it conscious. In addition, there's a different kind of spirit to it because your spiritual father is not being paid by you for sessions. Your relationship with him isn't just confined to sessions. He is doing he and you are both doing eternal work by pursuing this. So in that sense, he's not like an employee. He's not just somebody that's working for you for a fee. In addition, there's that last element that kind of flows from that the spiritual father's prayers and his love for you are a really important part of that relationship. So talking about the spiritual father as a therapist, so how is he like a therapist? He does heal. He does use psychological techniques to varying degrees, especially if he's trained in these or has received counseling, a counseling background at all. As I said before, because psychology is essentially just using these kind of things that we all have, this noticing the structure of reality, how humans communicate, how we get along, what will help us get along better, what will help us solve our problems. So of course he can use those, but ultimately his goal is on healing at a much deeper level than just therapy can provide. He cares about your mental health because he cares about you as a human, but really his ultimate goal is always going to be for your spiritual health and therefore your true health. So same deal, people might not enjoy therapy. There's hard work there. People also might not enjoy working with their spiritual father. He might have a hard word to say, but it's always aimed toward your health, always aimed toward your benefit. So he's there specifically for your salvation. He knows what he wants from you. Unlike psychology, where you sort of would go in and say, I'm having this problem with my mother, or I am having a hard time being assertive at work. I keep getting bullied, and or I haven't been able to get myself together after this breakup that I just had, or whatever. It's goal-oriented, and the psychologist's job is to help you solve your problems and work toward your goal. In the church, we all know what the goal is. The goal is salvation. The goal is life in Christ. So in that sense, he and you, there's this assumption that you're both pointing toward that goal and not just something that you've identified. Let me see. Perfect. So one way that the Orthodox might view mental health issues, I guess you could see a strong parallel to health issues, right? Our brain is part of our material existence just like our body is, and our body can be injured. And when our body is injured, that doesn't necessarily equate to like a spiritual thing. It doesn't mean you're going to heaven and hell or anything else like that, but we can seek care for it. Right? There's no push saying, like, as an Orthodox Christian, you can't go to the hospital or you can't seek pain relief or anything like that. These issues exist because of the fall. There's mortality, corruptibility, passibility, all these things that we experience as fallen creatures. So I think the Orthodox would see it like these are things that should not be. God did not make us to be injured. God did not make us to have this sort of fallen existence where we're constantly struggling against sin and fighting and getting beat up in the battle. And yet, there's no prohibition from seeking healing from wounds to your body or to your mind. I think the Orthodox would also say that mental health issues, and this is part of the broader worldview that we were talking about, perhaps in the kind of atheistic sort of worldview, you could say that any pain you're existing, it would be better if you didn't have that pain, right? Because in that sort of hedonistic worldview, there's no real right or wrong. There's sort of pain and pleasure. So of course you would always want to avoid pain and move toward pleasure. From an Orthodox perspective, you could even say, though, that a mental health issue or a struggle can be used as part of your salvation. It could be something that God is letting you struggle with to teach you some kind of greater skill. That's not to say that God is just like playing around and that all mental health issues are just things that it's just like God giving it to you or whatever, but it's more just that it's a possibility. We need to look at every struggle we go through, all these difficult things. Like if we injure our body, we could see a spiritual lesson in that. If we're struggling with something with our mind, we can see a spiritual lesson in that, right? So if we're feeling depressed and struggling with that, it could be, for example, God's sort of invitation, like, you need to learn to rely on me. Call out to me. Don't just think you can do this by yourself. Like look what happens when you try to do everything by yourself. Always point yourself toward me. And again, that's not to make a point about that's all mental health issues are, but it's just something that as an Orthodox Christian you can consider that God has his plan A and B for us. But just because it's something as God's plan B doesn't mean that it's not useful or that it's very good for us. We would say there's this complex relationship between biology, internal factors, consciousness, and the spiritual world, and all these mixed together. But we would also say that in most mental health conditions, it's always touched by the spiritual world. There's some kind of spiritual root for most mental health conditions, and if you kind of went down the line and examined all the different ones, which I think we'll actually do in more detail the next time, you can actually see how all these issues of our brain, because as I was saying earlier, our nous touches every part of our body and every part of our soul, it will affect invariably our mental health as well. But one kind of last thing to say on that is mental health issues should, I think, be distinct in an Orthodox perspective from spiritual issues. So, and this is one of the dangers that I think we can point out of inordinate use of mental health services and just relying on it too much, is that we can come to a point where we see that mental health services can help us with our problems, help us with our depression, help us with our anxiety, and then in that state of feeling healed from those afflictions, in our minds make that into some kind of spiritual health, right? I'm not depressed anymore, so therefore I am healed. That is, and making that spiritual health in your mind. It's possible to heal your mind and heal your thoughts in at least a surface level, while not being fully healed in a deep level. So like healing your body from a disease doesn't make you holy, right? If you beat cancer, it doesn't mean that you're going to be a saint. If you recover from some horrible illness, it doesn't mean that you're holy all of a sudden. In the same way, if you recover from a mental health issue, we have to be careful not to just say, like this is spiritual health. I've come to this healthy spiritual place. And it's confusing because of how inner our sense of mental health as well as spiritual health is. We can easily mess the two up. Let's see, so I've got like 10 minutes. So last kind of concept. So a little bit of a sum up of how these two fit together at this point. And again, this is assuming that we have the priority for mental health, like what I talked about last time. We have to view mental health as downstream of spiritual health, because the spiritual world informs our worldview. It tells us what's important, what our life is all about, where we're going. So we always have to be pursuing our mental health through the lens of our spiritual health, and not looking at mental health first and then saying, like, how can I paste some spiritual stuff on top of that? So assuming that you're having this priority for your spiritual life over just your mental health life or your sense of well-being, since the same thing we've said a few times already, since everything we do contributes to our life in Christ, therefore everything is spiritually relevant. Right? There's nothing in us that's outside of Christ. God gives us tools and gifts, and that doesn't just include the Eucharist, although it does, and the fathers and the teachings of the church and confession, but everything in our life. Everything that we have, everything we're experiencing is something that God has given us. And anytime you're given anything, there's always some sense of responsibility with it too. We've been given this field of psychology, and so in a sense, you could say, without taking it too far, that we might have some obligation of using it. Like if you're struggling with depression and you're stubbornly refusing to go to therapy, even though your priest is saying you should go to therapy, your family's saying you should go to therapy, that ends up just being selfishness. Right? This is something, people might say like, why won't God heal me? Right? And the obvious thing is like, this is something that exists now. Therapy is available, mental health treatments are available. This is the thing that you could be using. This is a tool that God has given to all of us, so we could use it. And in a sense, to deny using it and just completely shirk it out of hand is to not make use of this tool that God has given us. Like we said earlier, our rational mind and our spiritual mind kind of work together, and they're both ultimately healed when we live our Orthodox spiritual life. And another principle I think you can see from the Fathers is that a bad mental health life or a bad physical health life can be thought of not so much as like being bad spiritual life or like completely causing it, but maybe more accurate ways, they provide like fertile soil for a bad spiritual life. So for example, if you are riddled with depression and you can't get out of bed because you're so depressed, it's going to be hard to get to church and go to confession and do these other things that are good for your spiritual life. On the other hand, there's kind of, two extremes. The hard saying at the end of the day is that I think we have to admit that in the truest sense, Orthodox spiritual life doesn't actually need mental health. Strictly speaking, there are stories in the saints of God healing people from their mental health issue. There are stories in the saints of miraculous events, not just the saints, but even lots of common people. There are extraordinary situations. A couple quick examples of this principle. St. Isaac the Syrian says, "When grace is abundant in man, he easily scorned the fear of death, because he longs for righteousness and finds it in his soul." Many reasons why, let me see, I'll make sure I'm reading the right thing. Yeah, he says, many reasons why suffering tribulation is necessary for the sake of the fear of God. That was kind of a weird comment. Anyway, the idea there being that like, we have to say at the outset that grace can sort of like leapfrog over our mental health issues. It's not that like all mental health issues must be solved with the aid of secular mental health services. This is a possibility. It's something we see. God is not beholden to mental health. In that way, we could say that like in our spiritual lives, we can't say that we need mental health and that the church is somehow inadequate or something like that. However, that can be misleading and completely irrelevant. I think that idea mostly is irrelevant, practically speaking, because we don't live in this ideal sort of like saint's life, and we can't go on expecting to get miraculous treatments and sort of like tempting God by saying like, I'm not going to go get healing in the way that you've offered it. I'm just going to expect you to do it. We live in our current life, and we're expected to do what we can now with what we have. So we shouldn't neglect what we could do because of some possible extraordinary circumstance, but we should rather like pursue healing wherever we find it, with that understanding that God has given us that healing in even these mundane things like mental health or even physical health. So at the same time, we have to walk this balance of we can't deny the incredible kind of feats of our faith and miracles and that things can happen and the true healing that's available in the church, but we wouldn't presume to use that or to disparage others or to say you shouldn't go receive mental health. Because it's something that is available to us that we can and should use with that discerning openness that we talked about. So let me see what I've got next. Okay, I'll do one last slide because I feel like I'm getting kind of on a downer note where I'm kind of, I don't want to preaching that idea that, in the church we have all this available, and how dare you go to psychology or whatever for healing from it, right? And part of the reason for that today is just that we've been talking about this sort of philosophical assumptions with things. But that's not really the case at all. So let me continue just one last slide here, because I've heard this kind of issue with it. People will say a question like, why did the saints, for example, through the ages not need mental health, right? People that are against mental health and saying that you should just treat your mental health issues through prayer, etc. Would say, there are all these saints, they acquired healing. That's the real healing, that's eternity, that's what matters. So how come all these people didn't need mental health, but now we're just a bunch of softies and we need mental health? So a few thoughts on that. One, we have different problems in our modern era. Life is complex. We're all connected with each other. Unlike the old world where you kind of have to worry about what's going on in your village, we have to worry about everything that's going on in the whole world, right? We have different problems, and we're probably more stressed than anybody has ever been, even though our life is simultaneously easier in some ways. And that can lead to some different mental health issues. Another point, who's to say that they couldn't have benefited? Who's to say that they couldn't have used these services to avoid a lot of pain that they did go through? Another point, in a way they did. We've laid out that mental health and science is really just observation. It's just the science of learning what works to solve a given set of problems, right? And people have always known these. Maybe it hasn't been put together into a scientific form quite as in such an academic and scholarly way as it is today since Freud, etc. But people have always known that when you love somebody, it helps. People have always known that when you communicate with somebody, it helps. It makes them feel heard. So perhaps it was a little bit more of an archaic way of approaching these things and not quite as systematized. But people have always used these building blocks. And with that, mental health isn't some kind of new magic. It's, like I said, it's just observations about how people think and behave. I found an interesting, it's kind of weird with the context, but there's this sort of indirect proof of the saints validating the idea of psychology and what I'm talking about today. In St. John Cassian, he's talking about something that's not related to this. He's talking about the question of how demons can tempt us and how demons can attack us. And someone's asking him the question, how do demons know our thoughts? How do demons know what will tempt us? And can they somehow tell what's inside of us by just knowing it because they're spiritual beings? And I thought it was interesting. St. John Cassian says they don't somehow spiritually know, but all they do is they observe. They see what we see. They see what we say, they see what we do, and they understand human nature and how we work, and so they use that to target us. So again, like I said, weird context, but even St. John Cassian there in the, I think, 5th century was applying this same principle that human nature and what we're tempted to, what we're likely to do can be ascertained by just observing us, seeing what we do, and knowing how different actions, different thoughts would affect that and make us do something else. Psychologists just take that same principle, and rather than using it for evil, like what demons would use it for good, to try to heal relationships, bring people together, etc. So yeah, I would say in concluding to that idea, there are saints who, if you look at their life, you could say perhaps they were suffering from a mental health issue, and they should have or could have used mental health services or whatever. You can make these accusations about people through time, and yes, it's possible that people could have used mental health services or should have or whatever, but at the end of the day, I think we need to stay practical and say, like, that's their business. They're saints. They went through what they went through. That's their story. That's how they found their salvation. But at the end of the day, we answer for ourselves. We don't hang on everything on what could happen or the theoretical, but we live real lives. And when we are hurting, when we're broken, we seek healing. And like we've laid out, I think, we seek healing in the things that God has given us, because like we said at the beginning, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. So we can always move toward those things without shame, while also having this, I'll go into it more the next session, like the practical aspect of what to look out for, what to avoid, what to pursue in mental health, and how it, if it can be dangerous to our spiritual life, and if so, how. So we need to have that kind of discernment aspect of it, but never neglecting healing anywhere we found it, because it's always a gift from God, and we can always benefit from that. So I'll conclude there for the day. Any thoughts or questions? I know that was a lot of words, and some of it was kind of abstract, but no? Okay. Oh. Yeah. Thank you for sticking it out with me through that. Next time, all right. So this was a lot of theoretical. The next session is going to be all like practical. Like, what do we actually do now? So it's sort of like bringing all this knowledge together to leverage it into, like, okay, now what? So yes.
I had just a small thought about what you were saying about the secular worldviews and whatever. It's descriptive, but it can't be prescriptive.
Mm-hmm.
Like what you were saying about, can't say what should be done.
Mm-hmm.
Just says what is.
Right.
That helps me. Those two words help me to discern.
Yeah, like that doesn't mean it can't be used. Just like what we were saying with faith and reason, how faith points out like where reason should go. If you as an Orthodox Christian go to a mental health worker and you have that, what should be done figured out because you're taking your faith life into that mental health arena, you don't need mental health to point you into where you should go. You can just use them for what they're good for, right? Which is like, I'm having this problem. You're good at helping, people work through this kind of problem. He'll talk about that a little bit more next time, but I think that's one of the big benefits of being Orthodox and using mental health services, that you don't need to rely on their answers to those questions that they're not really qualified to provide an answer for anyway. Did you have your hand up?
So when you were talking about how people were dismissive of psychology and Orthodox, and they kind of wonder aloud or online or whatever, why can't we just, go with the church? The church built saints, why isn't that good enough? And so it made me kind of think that most of us, if we had a blockage in our artery, we would be more likely to seek out a heart doctor than we would to go to Father Van. I mean, we would ask him to pray for us, more than likely, but we would probably also have a doctor's appointment. So I guess my question is, what would you say is the difference between physical and mental health, especially with how we understand brain chemistry now?
Mm-hmm.
there doesn't seem to be a big divide, but yet there still seems to be a divide is how we think about it in society.
Yeah, that's a good point. So how do we talk about mental health and physical health differently? Is there a divide or a distinction there? It's interesting. Just like Christ's two natures are united, like they're both touching each other, but they're not mixing into each other. But yet they both affect each other in a certain way, right? But we don't exactly know how to say with precision how exactly. So I think the same thing works with our mental and our physical. You can't completely separate them because, as you said, there are different brain chemicals, and if you don't have, say, enough serotonin in your brain, you will feel depressed. Like that's how your brain gets you to feel like certain feelings and certain mental states. And so if it's just not there, then you'll feel depressed. And it's like, but that's the physical seeming to just have this like tyrannical relationship over the mental. So the way I would think about it is that they both do touch each other, and they both interrelate to each other, just like how we are a body and we are a soul, and our mental health is sort of has one foot in our body and one foot in our soul for those reasons, because it's like our brain is a physical thing that thinks thoughts, and yet our thoughts affect our spiritual life and our mental health and our physical health. So everything is affecting everything else. I guess to a large extent you could just say that the way we think about them is just, not like arbitrary, but we just separate them in terms of like when it's useful to separate them or when it seems like we can separate them. Because I think, just like we see with everything in our Orthodox theology, like everything's holistic. Nothing is like put apart or separated or compartmentalized. They're both interrelated. So I guess I would say the same thing. I don't know if that really answered your question, but
I think I see people have the separation between the two, which doesn't seem to fit with our understanding of science. But it seems like a lot of the time people who are willing to go to a therapist are perfectly willing to go to a
right. Yeah, it's like both of these things are realities. Like, you can't just deny your mental state or your feelings. It's like that's not real in a way that my body is real. That's, that was the point of kind of what we went over earlier, that like in Orthodoxy the body is central to who we are. And our body includes our brain, which, as I said, affects our thoughts. But in addition to the physical, we also have, like what I was talking about earlier with like the nous, these things that are related to our physical body. And if you read especially the Philokalia, you'll see like the fathers are always talking about how the nous is in the heart, and when you're praying the prayer of the heart. That's the whole hesychastic tradition, is like taking the mind and lowering it to like your physical heart. So there's this great respect in the Orthodox tradition for the body and how it impacts everything we think and everything we do. So yeah, I would say it's wrong to overly separate those two and act like you can actually cut off between those two. And that's partially why it's so wrong that death exists, the soul being ripped from the body. That's not natural. That was never supposed to be part of our Constitution. But, interesting question.
There's a really interesting podcast, OTFR, Orthodox Christian Medical Professional, that has some of that. And one of the things I think is the stigma of mental health, but if understanding without separating body and soul, that for, say, someone who has a lack of serotonin, that they need their mental health medications just like a diabetic, to bring that unity when they're seeking that spiritual health, that their brain chemicals can catch up, to bring them to that place where they can get out of bed and function and seek that spiritual health. But OTMR, I think, has a lot on that to have more than just mental health professionals, but the Christian mental health professionals, like you were talking about, seeking out who have that Orthodox perspective on the mental health stuff. That too. It's very interesting.
Okay, yeah, I'd be interested in that. Yeah, I think that's, I I want to say that's why we have this idea of a separation between like physical health and mental health, is because there is a certain subjectivity to mental health, because it's a fact that you can have low serotonin and you will feel depressed. But at the same point, there are various ways and things you can do and ways of thinking to kind of like lift yourself out of that. And again, there's a complex interrelationship where those ways of thinking could be the thing that produces the more serotonin to make you feel better. But the mental health stuff just seems subjective. And sometimes it is. Like if you're not having severe depression and you're just a little bit bummed out, then you can just kind of force yourself to go for a walk or something and it might make you feel better. And so there are, I guess there's that perceived like subjectivity there. And so I think people take that subjectivity and then they say, well, it's all in your mind. And then they use that to completely deny the existence of the possibility of a mental health condition, which is problematic. Yes?
So I move to make this remark. Because there's no moral compass with standard mental health therapies, we've seen, and forgive me because I haven't validated this lately, but it occurs to me from my previous experience in talking with somebody who is a psychologist that the American Psychological Association has basically not taken any positions against things like pedophilia and sexual identity issues, and in fact have endorsed, basically, quote unquote, endorsed supporting individuals who want to go in those directions. Mm-hmm. And, I wonder, this is the destruction of the human soul, and I can't see that profession enduring without spiritual.
Yeah, I think it can go astray and cause a lot of problems with that. I mean, and you can see how their morality and their view of what should be is arbitrary just from the fact that, for example, with the gender identity question, that used to be considered a disorder, and now it's not considered a disorder. It used to be, gender identity disorder. And it used to be something that they would say this is something that is a mental health issue and needs to be treated because it's wrong, right? And so they were making that assumption that it's wrong, and now they've just made another assumption that it's actually not wrong. And there's nothing that's going to point them to right or wrong either way in that, because now they're just saying this is something that this person wants to live like. We need to help them flourish. It will make them happier if we affirm their identity, etc. So therefore, it's not a problem that we need to say we need to fix your gender identity. We just need to make you happy, right? And so that's a like very practical, I think, demonstration of like how they can't say what's right or wrong, and we definitely shouldn't look to them for what's right or wrong, but while also not denying the wisdom they have with the things that they actually are expert in.
The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that classifies things used to be based on sort of a Judeo-Christian ethic, in that there was a moral standard. And it seems to me that what it's done across the years is to move away from any moral standard to move into what is bothering the person. So if something like pedophilia or gender dysphoria or whatever does not interfere with your personal function, which often means your personal satisfaction, then it is not a disorder.
Right.
I know a number of therapists who do not agree with that. Sure, if you're going to treat someone in the mental health area, you have to have a diagnosis in order to get somebody to pay for that treatment. So, I mean, it's kind of a catch-22. You've got to have a diagnosis, but then when you give a diagnosis to someone, you're stuck with it, and you become that in the world. So it's a really hard thing for professionals to deal with that kind of issue.
And like practically speaking, that can be a downside. I mean, you can turn somebody into a professional patient. You might have again, it's complicated. You have to be balanced on both sides. But diagnosing somebody with, say, depression, there's always the risk that they could say, I'm depressed. And so of course I'm not going to be able to get out of bed today. Of course I'm not going to be able to do anything worthwhile because I have depression. I am depression is kind of reading between the lines there. And so it's not good, I don't think, that sort of like mind over matter sort of thing where it's like, shut up and stop crying about it. That's wrong too. But also you have to admit that having a little bit of a mind over matter attitude will allow you to work through a lot of things that otherwise you might be trapped in if you were telling yourself, like, I can't do anything about this, it's a disease. So you have to like kind of keep that tension between like pushing yourself but also accepting reality and not pushing yourself unwisely, I guess. But it's interesting. And with the pedophilia, I mean, like, I think most therapists would like, instinctively be disgusted by like, pedophilia because I think that's the way things work. Like, we all have a conscience, we all have a standard in our mind, and we just feel that way. But what secularism does is slowly strip those things away and say, well, how can you justify that? So you say it's bad to be a pedophile or to engage in like bestiality or whatever else. How can you justify that? What's wrong? What if it's consensual? Who are you to say that there's a certain age that like only past this age is it legal or consensual? Or who are you to say that like a man and a dolphin can't love each other? But seriously, like if you're assuming atheism, unless you're going to use some kind of natural law argument, there's no way to actually like argue that that's immoral or wrong. And so, yeah, I mean, I worry about the field if it keeps going like that, like, because that's only logical if they're assuming that worldview. And I just hope that people can use it, like I've been saying, for what it's good for. Use it like a tool. Don't let the tool use you, because it will misuse you.
So I mentioned that the distinction between descriptive and prescriptive is helpful. It's like moralism can be eternally descriptive, describing things, describing realities, but it can't be prescriptive in an ontological way. What should be? Moralism is different than morality. You can be moralistic about things, but that doesn't say what's right or wrong. God's law is what's prescriptive to good.
Like science can say what is, science cannot say what ought to be, is the way I usually hear. Is and ought. But psychology is the field where like it kind of like bleeds over into our lives and like these questions we have of how to live our lives. So they, without even trying to, will start answering these ought questions. And I think that's one of the things we have to be aware of in interacting with it. Yes.
Well, I think it's important that you choose the right therapist to be.
Right.
I went in today, any therapist that wasn't a Christian, and didn't have that Christian worldview, because I think they're missing a whole part of the human being.
Right.
A whole big part.
Yeah, I mean I was a therapist in a prison before I came here, and one of the things before I went to seminary, and the thing that bummed me out more than anything as I was working as a therapist and trying to help these guys was that I knew what they needed a lot. That there would be times where it's like, this guy needs to say the Jesus prayer. That's what he needs. But I can't tell him that because I'm a state employee who's a secular therapist. And so it's kind of like torture to have to not give him what he needs. And so but the whole idea of like what kind of therapist to choose, that will be like a major thing that I go over the next class. Do you need a Christian therapist, upsides and downsides? of that, because I would say that there are some downsides to having a Christian therapist to be aware of as well. I mean, they might not be Orthodox, they might be a different kind of Christian from you, they might be a really liberal Christian that like affirms things we can't affirm, etc. So it can almost, if it's done really badly, a Christian therapist can almost be worse than just a secular therapist sometimes. So we'll get into that next time. Next time will be a lot lighter, I promise. All right, anything else? Okay. All right, thank you everyone. Let's sing It Is Truly Meet.